In the South Pacific, early March of 1943, the sea was alive with tension. The waves carried more than salt and spray. They carried history. Beneath the blazing tropical sun, the fate of entire armies and the direction of a war were about to be decided on a narrow stretch of ocean between New Guinea and New Britain. It would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And within that battle, a moment just 50 seconds long would decide the fate of countless men aboard Japanese transports and destroyers. 50 seconds before American skip bombing B-25s roared down, unleashing devastation unlike anything the Imperial Navy had ever seen. But to understand those fateful seconds, we must go back to a time when Japan's war machine was still expanding and when the Allies were desperately trying to hold the line in the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across Asia and Pacific, capturing territory at a speed that left the world stunned. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Burma to the Solomon Islands, the rising sun flag seemed unstoppable. Yet by 1942, cracks began to form. Battles like Midway and Guadalcanal had bled Japan's navy and stalled their advance. Still, the Japanese high command was far from finished. They needed to reinforce their strongholds and push back against the growing Allied presence in New Guinea, a critical stepping stone in their grand plan to isolate Australia and force the Western powers into a stalemate. For the Allies, New Guinea was more than just a battlefield. It was a lifeline. Holding it meant keeping supply routes open, protecting Australia, and setting the stage for a counteroffensive that could roll back the Japanese empire. Every jungle airstrip, every coastal village, every mile of shoreline mattered. And in early 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army was preparing to deliver thousands of reinforcements across the Bismarck Sea, right into the jaws of Allied air power. The Japanese convoy set out from Rabaul, one of their most important bases in the Pacific. 8 transport ships, escorted by 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 troops, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Their destination, Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea. If they reached it intact, Japanese forces on the island would be reinforced, possibly tipping the balance in their favor. If they didn't, it could cripple Japan's strength in the region. The convoy commanders knew the risks. Allied aircraft, particularly those of the U.S. 5th Air Force under General George C. Kenney, prowled the skies daily. Kenney had a reputation: innovative, daring, and willing to push his men and their machines into untested tactics. He and his pilots have been perfecting a deadly new way of attacking ships: skip bombing. Traditional high-altitude bombing against moving ships had proven frustratingly ineffective. Bombs dropped from thousands of feet up were inaccurate, often splashing harmlessly into the sea. Torpedo attacks were better, but Allied torpedo stocks were limited, and the Japanese had developed tactics to counter them. Kenney's solution was deceptively simple: fly low, dangerously low, at wave-top height. Drop bombs at short range, so they skipped across the water like stones, slamming into the side of enemy ships at or just above the waterline, where armor was weakest. It was fast, terrifying, and deadly. By February 1943, Kenney's men had trained relentlessly, practicing until they could bring their B-25 Mitchell bombers and A-20 Havocs down to treetop level, roaring in at speeds that gave enemy gunners little chance to react. When the Japanese convoy set sail, Kenney and his commanders saw an opportunity to put this new tactic to the ultimate test. But for the Japanese captains aboard those transports and destroyers, the full reality of skip bombing was still unknown. They had faced air raids before, but they believed their anti-aircraft fire and evasive maneuvers could ward off most attacks. They had faith in their gunners, their zigzag courses, and the speed of their destroyer escorts. What they did not yet understand was that in the coming battle, their defenses would mean little when American bombers came shrieking down at mast height, releasing bombs that would cover the distance between sky and sea in the blink of an eye. The convoy's voyage across the Bismarck Sea was a tense one. Spotter planes had already picked them up, and Allied reconnaissance tracked their progress relentlessly. Japanese officers knew they were being watched, but what choice did they have? The troops had to get through, and speed was their only ally. Still, in every wardroom and bridge, a question lingered unspoken. Would the convoy make it, or were they sailing straight into disaster? For the men aboard the transports, Soldiers packed into tight quarters below deck. The journey was suffocating. The heat was unbearable. The smell of sweat and oil thick in the air. Many knew little of the danger ahead, convinced that the mighty Imperial Navy would shield them from harm. They sang songs, played cards, and wrote letters home, while above them, Japanese captains scanned the skies with binoculars, waiting for the first sign of enemy aircraft. When it came with a fury. Allied planes appeared on the horizon, glinting silver against the blue sky, engines snarling as they closed in. At first, the Japanese captains thought they faced another high-altitude bombing raid. Nuisance, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but survivable. Crews ran to battle stations, anti-aircraft guns swiveled skyward, and destroyers prepared to throw up curtains of fire. But what the Japanese did not know, what they could not yet imagine, was that the real threat was not coming from the high heavens. It was coming from the deck of the ocean itself. In just moments, American bombers would sweep in so low their propellers nearly kissed the waves. And when they did, the Japanese captains would have no more than 50 seconds to react. 50 seconds before bombs skipped across the water, slammed into steel hulls, and turned calm seas into infernos of smoke and flame. 50 seconds. That was all the time they had. Enough to shout an order, to twist the wheel, to fire guns blindly into the oncoming storm. But not enough to stop what was coming. Not enough to undo the trap they had sailed into. Not enough to change history. As the first wave of bombers roared down, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea began in earnest, and from that moment forward, the Pacific War would never be the same. The convoys stretched across the Bismarck Sea like a steel procession, transports laden with men and supplies, destroyers slicing through the waves to guard them. The Japanese captains barked orders from their bridges, scanning the skies for silhouettes. When the first American bombers appeared, the sea seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Engines thundered, sun glinted off wings, and suddenly the stillness of the Pacific shattered. 17 flying fortresses had already softened the convoy with high-level attacks, dropping bombs from altitudes beyond Japanese guns. Some struck near, some far, but the Japanese still held formation, their destroyers weaving to protect the vulnerable transports. Gunners fired skyward, tracer rounds streaking red and orange across the sky. The air was alive with lead. For a moment, it seemed like the convoy might weather the storm. But the Americans were only beginning. The real blow came at low level. At treetop height, the roar of B-25 Mitchells filled the air. Pilots flew so close to the water that waves foamed in their slipstreams. They came in fast, deliberate, fearless, the product of weeks of training in a tactic the Japanese had never truly faced. Skip bombing was an art of speed, precision, and nerves of steel. The bombers lined up on their runs, descended almost a mast height, and released bombs that bounced once, twice, across the surface like skipping stones. Except these stones weighed 500 pounds and carried enough explosive to rip a steel ship in half. The Japanese gunners swung their weapons down, raking the bombers with fire, but the Americans were too close, too fast. In less than a minute, bombs tore in the hulls, erupting in plumes of flame and water. One transport shuddered under the impact, listing as fire spread from its hold. Men scrambled on deck, some leaping into the sea, others trapped below as the ship groaned and began to sink. Another vessel was struck amidships, the blast tearing through crowded compartments packed with soldiers. The ocean that seemed calm just moments before was now littered with wreckage, bodies, and burning oil. For the Japanese captains, the nightmare was unlike anything they had imagined. Training and doctrine had prepared them for high-altitude raids, for torpedo attacks, even for submarines lurking below. But nothing in their manuals described American bombers swooping at mast height, dropping bombs that skipped like deadly stones. They had seconds, 50 at most, to react. Orders were shouted, wheels spun, guns blazed, but the attackers were already on top of them. The destroyers fought with desperate fury. They swung hard, throwing up sheets of fire, their captains trying to shield the lumbering transports. Some succeeded in dodging a strike, but others weren't so lucky. A destroyer took a direct hit near the stern, the blast shearing off its propellers and leaving it dead in the water. Another transport staggered as bomb after bomb slammed home, breaking its back. Above the chaos, American aircrews pressed their attack with deadly efficiency. The Mitchells had been modified for this very mission. Nose guns had been added, giving each bomber a terrifying array of firepower. As they roared in, pilots strafed decks, shredding Japanese gunners and scattering soldiers in panic. It was a storm of lead and steel, and every pass left another ship crippled or burning. The Japanese convoy began to unravel. Smoke poured skyward, obscuring the horizon. Destroyers weaved wildly, trying to rescue survivors, while transports drifted helplessly. The carefully ordered formation dissolved into chaos. From above, Allied pilots could see the effect. The convoy was breaking, and now it was a slaughter. And yet, amid the destruction, something else became clear. This wasn't just a victory. It was the birth of a new kind of naval warfare. Until then, surface fleets had feared torpedoes and submarines. But now, aircraft, even medium bombers like the B-25, had become the deadliest ship killers on the sea. Skip bombing was proving devastating, a tactic that would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. What made it so effective was its simplicity. Pilots didn't need to drop from thousands of feet, calculating wind and drift. They didn't need torpedoes, which required precise angles and slow, vulnerable approaches. Instead, they used ordinary bombs, dropped at short range with near-guaranteed accuracy. And because they flew so low, Japanese gunners had almost no time to aim. 50 seconds, that was all. In a world of war, 50 seconds could mean the difference between life and death. The Allied attacks didn't come just once. They came in waves. After the Mitchells and Havoc struck, Australian bullfighters swooped in, unleashing their own fury. These heavy fighters strafed decks with cannon fire, silencing gun crews and leaving ships exposed to the next wave of bombers. Together, the Americans and Australians created a rhythm of destruction, first suppressing defenses, then striking ships, then circling back to finish what was left afloat. By the second day of battle, the Japanese convoy was shattered. Ship after ship lay sinking or ablaze. The transports, meant to deliver thousands of reinforcements to Lae, were gone. Nearly every vessel had been destroyed. Survivors clung to wreckage, drifting in oil-stained waters, while Allied planes circled overhead, picking off stragglers. For the Japanese, it was a disaster of unimaginable scale. Nearly 3,000 soldiers drowned, burned, or were killed outright. Thousands more floated helplessly in the sea. The Imperial Japanese Army had hoped to reinforce New Guinea with fresh strength. Instead, it had lost entire battalions in a single blow. The Allies were stunned by the scale of their own success. What had once seemed a desperate gamble, low-level attacks at mass height, had turned into one of the most decisive victories of the Pacific Air War. General Kenny's gamble had paid off. Skip bombing was now proven, not just as theory, but as practice. There were haunting details, though, stories that added to the battle's dark legacy. Survivors in the water, desperate for rescue, were targeted by Allied aircraft. Many were strafed, some bombed, to prevent them from swimming ashore and rejoining the fight. To modernize, it feels brutal, even merciless. But to the men in those cockpits, it was war without compromise. If the survivors reached land, they would live to fight again. Mercy had no place in the calculations of 1943. One striking fact often overlooked is how fast the battle turned. Hours earlier, the convoy was intact, steaming confidently toward Lae. Then, in the space of less than 2 days, it was gone, reduced to smoldering wrecks and oil-slicked waters. Historians later noted that this single battle saved Australia from the threat of Japanese reinforcements and marked a turning point in the New Guinea campaign. The Japanese would never again attempt to send such a large convoy through contested waters. For the men who fought it, though, the memory was raw. American and Australian pilots recalled the sight of ships exploding beneath them, the heat of burning oil rising through their cockpits, the flash of tracer fire streaking past their wings. Japanese survivors remembered leaping into the sea, clutching wreckage, watching their comrades vanish beneath the waves. 50 seconds. That was all it took. And as the sun set over the Bismarck Sea, it was clear that nothing about the Pacific War would ever be the same. The morning after the convoy was shattered, the waters of the Bismarck Sea were an open graveyard. Columns of smoke drifted upward, black scars against the bright Pacific sky. The sea itself was littered with wreckage, splintered planks, twisted metal, burned lifeboats, and the floating bodies of men who had never reached the shores of New Guinea. The battle was over, but its echoes had only just begun. For the Japanese commanders who had risked everything on this convoy, the scale of the disaster was unthinkable. 8 transports gone. For destroyers sunk. Thousands of troops who had been meant to reinforce La and turn the tide in New Guinea, instead lost to the sea. It was more than a defeat, it was annihilation. What remained of the convoy scattered back toward Rabaul, their mission undone, their confidence shattered. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled on its ability to shield an army across contested waters. Now that faith was gone. Survivors drifted in the water, clinging to debris, oil burning their skin, salt searing their wounds. Many called out for rescue, but few came. Allied aircraft continued to patrol overhead, their orders merciless. Deny the enemy every chance of survival. In some cases, planes opened fire on rafts, raking survivors with bullets. It was a brutal act, one that still stirs controversy among historians. But in the logic of 1943, it made cold sense. Every man who swam ashore might someday fire a rifle against an Allied soldier in the jungles of New Guinea. In war, compassion often drowned beneath the tides of strategy. Yet not all were killed. Some did make it to the coast, staggering ashore half dead. Others pulled from the sea by the few destroyers that escaped the slaughter. For them, survival came at cost. The memory of those burning ships, of comrades screaming as fire swept to the holds, of the sea itself turning red. For the Japanese army, those memories became scars they carried into every battle afterward. News of the battle spread quickly. In Australia, headlines blared with triumph. Japanese convoy destroyed. Families who had feared invasion now breathed easier, reassured that the tide of war was shifting. To Allied soldiers slogging through the mud and jungle of New Guinea, it was proof that the enemy could be starved of reinforcements, that their sacrifice on the ground was not in vain. And in Washington and London, the Bismarck Sea became a case study in the power of air superiority. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on strategy itself. Before this battle, the idea of medium bombers sinking heavily escorted convoys seemed bold, almost reckless. After the Bismarck Sea, it became doctrine. Skip bombing was refined, perfected, and adopted across the Pacific. Naval commanders now knew that without control of the skies, ships were little more than targets waiting to burn. The age of the carrier and the bomber had truly arrived. For the Japanese, the loss was crippling. Their hold on New Guinea had depended on fresh troops and supplies. Without them, their garrisons weakened, morale faltered, and initiative slipped from their grasp. Never again would the Japanese attempt to send such a large convoy through contested waters. The Bismarck Sea had closed that chapter forever. From then on, their movements were cautious, fragmented, and often futile. The Allies, emboldened, pressed harder, slowly grinding down Japan's empire island by island, mile by mile. There is a strange irony in the battle's legacy. The very tactic that ensured Allied victory, skip bombing, was not born in some grand laboratory or Admiralty boardroom. It was born from necessity, from improvisation, from daring pilots and commanders who refused to accept failure. They turned their bombers into ship killers with little more than creativity, training, and raw courage. And in doing so, they reshaped the Pacific War. Yet behind the tactics, behind the strategy, lies the human story. For the American and Australian airmen, the battle was both a triumph and a trauma. Many remember the sight of ships erupting beneath them, of explosions that seemed to tear the sea itself apart. They celebrated victory, yes, but also carried with them the faces of men leaping from burning decks, of survivors left behind in waters thick with oil. For some, those images haunted their dreams long after the war ended. For the Japanese soldiers who perished, most never even had the chance to fight. They had trained, drilled, and prepared for jungle combat in New Guinea. Instead, they drowned in steel coffins before their boots ever touched sand. They became victims not of bayonets or rifles, but of innovation, of a new kind of warfare where survival was decided in seconds. 50 seconds, that fleeting window when captains tried to turn, when gunners fired blindly, when lives hung in the balance. That was the measure between life and death. When historians look back, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea often appears as one more entry in the long catalog of the Pacific War. But for those who lived it, it was unforgettable. It was a roar of engines skimming the waves, the shriek of bombs skipping across water, the thunder of explosions that cracked the sky. It was a moment when the Pacific itself seemed to catch fire. And in those waters, amid the wreckage, a truth emerged. The war in the Pacific would not be decided by who had the largest battleships or the most troops on the ground. It would be decided by who controlled the air, by who could innovate faster, by who could strike hardest in the smallest window of time. The Bismarck Sea was proof. When the battle ended, Allied commanders tallied their success with precision. Every Japanese transport sunk, for destroyers destroyed, the enemy's losses numbering in the thousands. Allied losses? Barely a handful of aircraft, a few brave men who never returned. The contrast was staggering. The battle was not just a victory, it was a statement. The Japanese Empire, once thought unstoppable, had been shown vulnerable. Their armies could be cut off, their ships sunk, their ambitions thwarted. For the Allies, it was more than a tactical win. It was a promise that with courage, innovation, and relentless pressure, the tide of war could be turned. In the end, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only a few days, but its impact stretched across the years that followed, shaping the course of the Pacific War, hastening the collapse of Japan's empire, and ensuring that the shadow of invasion never fell across Australia. 50 seconds. That was all the Japanese captains had when the skip bombers came. 50 seconds of fight, to hope, to survive. It wasn't enough. In those seconds, history shifted, and the Pacific Ocean itself bore witness to the fall of a convoy, the rise of a tactic, and the relentless truth of war. And as the smoke cleared, the lesson was written not in books or reports, but in the silence of seas scattered with wrecks. In war, innovation and courage could crush even the strongest fleets. In war, 50 seconds could decide the fate of thousands. The Bismarck Sea had spoken, and its voice was thunder.